November 7, 1849, in Chatham County, Georgia. On an auction platform in the center of Savannah's public market, a woman stands. Rope binds her hands, rope that has already worn the skin of her wrists raw. She is 22 years old, 5 months pregnant, and she is about to be sold for 19 cents. Not 19. 19 cents, less than the cost of a pound of coffee. In his hands, the auctioneer, a man named Cyrus Feldman, holds the deed of sale, his voice carrying across the crowd with practiced efficiency. But with this auction, something is wrong. Something that makes even the hardened slave traders in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Something that will set in motion a chain of events so disturbing that the city of Savannah will spend the next 80 years trying to erase every record of what happened that day. Tonight we reveal the truth they buried, and we will follow this woman's story to its shocking conclusion. A conclusion that involves murder, betrayal, and an act of resistance so brutal that when it was finally discovered in 1931, the authorities immediately sealed the evidence and forbade anyone from speaking about it publicly. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. Before we go any further into what happened in Savannah on that November morning, I need you to do something important. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell, because stories like this, stories that expose the darkest chapters of American history, these are the stories that get buried, suppressed, forgotten. And I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Let's see how far this story reaches. Let's build a community that refuses to let these truths disappear. Now, let's continue. The woman standing on that platform has a name, though in official records it appears only twice, and both times it is spelled differently. In the bill of sale from her previous owner, she is listed as Dinina. In the coroner's report filed 6 years later, she is called Dinina. For our purposes, we will call her Dinina, because that is the name she used when she finally spoke. When she finally told her story to the one person who listened. Dinina was born in 1827 on a rice plantation outside Charleston, South Carolina. Her father she never knew. Her mother, a woman named Patience, worked in the fields from sunrise until long after dark, her hands permanently stained green from rice stalks, her back bent from years of labor that would eventually kill her when Dinina was just 11 years old. After Patience died, Dinina was sold to a tobacco merchant in Charleston, a man named Elias Cartwright, who needed domestic help for his growing household. Elias was 43 years old, married to a woman named Constance, and father to 4 children ranging in age from 6 to 15. A deacon at the First Presbyterian Church, a member of the Charleston Chamber of Commerce, and by all public accounts, a respectable businessman who treated his property, human and otherwise, with appropriate Christian values. That was the public account. The private reality was something else entirely. For 3 years, from age 11 to 14, Dinina worked in the Cartwright household. She cleaned, she cooked. She cared for the younger children. She did everything that was demanded of her. And Elias Cartwright watched her. He watched her in that particular way that enslaved women learned to recognize. That predatory attention that signaled danger, that made survival require constant vigilance. When Dinina turned 14, Elias's attention became something more than watching. It became action. What happened between them? If we can even use that word between, as though there was any equality or choice involved. What happened was rape. Systematic, repeated, sustained over years. Dinina had no power to refuse. No legal right to deny their owners anything did enslaved women have. The law did not recognize their bodily autonomy. The law considered them property, and property cannot be violated because property has no self to violate. Constance Cartwright knew. She knew because enslaved women who worked in close quarters, could not hide pregnancy. She knew because Dinina's body changed in ways that made the truth unavoidable. But her husband she did not confront. Dinina she confronted. She accused Dinina of seduction, of tempting a good Christian man, of deliberately destroying the sanctity of a godly household. Entirely with the 16th year, old girl who had no power to say no, the blame in Constance's worldview lay, rather than with the 46-year-old man who had absolute power to take whatever he wanted. In March of 1843, Dinina gave birth to a daughter. Noticeably light-skinned was the child, her features clearly indicating mixed parentage. Elias Cartwright refused to acknowledge the child as his. He named her Ruth, had her registered in his property ledger, as the offspring of his servant Dinah, father unknown, and continued his life exactly as before. Constance demanded that Dinah and the baby be removed from the main house. To the servants' quarters they were relocated. A cramped structure behind the main residence, where 6 other enslaved people lived in conditions that barely qualified as shelter. Dinina raised Ruth while continuing to work in the Cartwright household. After 16-hour days of labor, she nursed her daughter at night. In whispers, she sang to her songs her own mother had sung, songs that carried memories of Africa, of freedom, of a world before chains. And she watched as Ruth grew, as the child's features became increasingly undeniable evidence of who her father was, as the resemblance to Elias Cartwright became so obvious that neighbors began to whisper, to speculate, to understand what everyone had always known but politely ignored. In 1847, when Ruth was 4 years old, Elias Cartwright sold her. For $400. He sold her to a slave trader named Marcus Pennington. A standard price for a healthy child of that age. On a Tuesday morning, without warning Dinina, without allowing goodbyes, without permitting the mother even a final moment with her daughter, he sold her. Working in the kitchen was Dinina when she heard Ruth screaming from the front of the house. By the time she ran outside, the child was already gone, loaded into a wagon that was disappearing down the street, her small hands reaching back toward the only home she had ever known. In the street, Dinina collapsed. The other enslaved people in the household had to carry her inside. For 3 days she did not speak, did not eat, barely moved. Into a state of grief so profound that it resembled death itself she had entered, and perhaps she wished it was. But she did not die. That mercy her body refused her. Instead, she survived, and survival meant returning to work. Meant continuing to serve the man who had raped her, and then sold the child born of that rape. Meant functioning in a world designed to destroy her humanity piece by piece. 2 years later, in the summer of 1849, Dinina became pregnant again. Elias Cartwright was the father. No question about this existed, no ambiguity. Immediate and absolute was Constance Cartwright's fury. One incident, one child, one public embarrassment she could tolerate. But the situation a second pregnancy made undeniable, made it impossible to maintain the fiction that Dinina was a seductress and Elias an innocent victim of temptation. The truth a second pregnancy revealed: Elias Cartwright was a man who repeatedly raped an enslaved woman he owned, who had been doing so for years, who showed no intention of stopping. An ultimatum Constance gave Elias: get rid of her. I will not have that woman in my house bearing your children while I live under the same roof. Sell her, trade her, give her away. I do not care. But within the month she leaves this household, or I will make this situation public in ways that will destroy your reputation permanently. The threat Elias understood. On maintaining respectability, his position in Charleston society depended. To be discreet about their violations of enslaved women, wealthy men were expected. Whispered about perhaps, but never openly That would cross a line that even Charleston's tolerant attitude towards slavery could not ignore. So arrangements Elias made. A business associate in Savannah he contacted, a merchant named William Hadley, who owed him money from a failed cotton investment. A transaction Elias proposed. He would forgive Hadley's debt, approximately $800, in exchange for Hadley purchasing Dinah and taking her to Savannah. Far enough from Charleston that she would never return. Far enough that Constance would never have to see her again. Far enough that Elias could pretend she had never existed. Hadley agreed. For early November, during Savannah's regular public auction, where such sales occurred with administrative efficiency, the transaction was arranged. But one specific condition Elias added to the sale, a condition so cruel that it reveals the depth of his vindictiveness. At 19 cents he set Dinina's minimum price. Deliberate, calculated to humiliate was the amount. In 1849, from 700 to 900 the average price for an enslaved woman of childbearing age ranged. Even higher, a pregnant woman carrying a child who would eventually become additional property should have been valued. By setting the price at 19 cents, Elias achieved several goals simultaneously. That Dinina had no value to him whatsoever, he demonstrated. That she would be purchased by someone who recognized she was being offered as damaged goods. Someone who would treat her accordingly, he ensured. And most importantly, he guaranteed that Dinina would understand exactly how worthless he considered her, how utterly disposable she was in his eyes. To Charleston in early November, William Hadley traveled to finalize the arrangement. In the man's study he met with Elias, reviewed the paperwork, signed the necessary documents. Meticulously prepared was the bill of sale, listing Dinah's approximate age, her condition, pregnant, approximately 5 months, and the agreed-upon price 19 cents. With the same pen he used to sign church documents and business contracts, Elias Cartwright signed his name. Neat, legible, totally unremarkable was his signature. Just another transaction in a life built on transactions. Of the sale the night before she was to leave Charleston, Dinina was informed. No choice was she given. No opportunity to gather belongings because she had no belongings. No chance to say goodbye to the people she had lived alongside for years. Property being transferred from one owner to another, she was simply, and property did not require emotional consideration. 2 days by wagon the journey from Charleston to Savannah took. A driver Hadley hired, a white man named Silas Burke, who specialized in transporting human cargo. In the back of the wagon Dinina rode, her hands bound. A precaution against escape. Though where would she run? 5 months pregnant, in a region where every white person was empowered to stop and question any black person traveling without papers. On November 6th, they arrived in Savannah. Larger than Charleston was the city, busier, filled with the sounds of commerce and construction. With activity the port hummed, ships loading and unloading goods from across the world. Cotton and rice and tobacco flowing out, manufactured items and luxury goods flowing in, and human beings, thousands of human beings being bought and sold and traded like livestock. Directly to the auction house William Hadley took Dinina, a large wooden structure near the waterfront where sales occurred 3 times weekly. With the practiced eye of someone who had evaluated thousands of people for sale, the auctioneer, Cyrus Feldman, examined Dinah. Her age he noted, her condition, her general health. Then the bill of sale he saw the minimum price of 19 cents, and his expression changed. "Something is wrong with this one," Feldman said to Hadley. "What is it? Disease? Injury? Mental deficiency?" "Nothing like that," Hadley replied. "She is healthy, able to work. The child appears viable." "Then why 19 cents? The seller wanted her gone quickly. "A personal matter it is. A family dispute." Immediately Feldman understood. done something this woman had, or had something done to her that made her previous owner want her removed from his household. A signal the low price was a warning to potential buyers. This property comes with complications. That in the auction description you will include, Feldman said. I will not misrepresent her condition and risk my reputation. Hadley agreed. How Feldman presented Dinina to the crowd he did not care. Simply to complete the transaction he wanted, to collect his compensation for the debt Elias had forgiven, and to move on with his business. For the following morning, November 7th, at 10:00 a.m., the auction was scheduled. In a holding cell beneath the auction house Dinina spent the night, a damp stone room where people awaiting sale were kept like animals in pens. She did not sleep. Against the cold wall she sat with her back, her hands resting on her stomach, feeling the child move inside her. This child who would be born into slavery, who would never know freedom, who would belong to William Hadley, or whoever purchased them at auction, who would live and die as property. Unless something changed, unless the entire system collapsed, and in November of 1849, as likely as the sky opening up and God himself descending to pass judgment on the men who built their fortunes on human suffering, that seemed. When morning came, up from the holding cell Dinina was brought and positioned near the auction platform. Gathering, she could see the crowd, perhaps 60 or 70 people, some serious buyers, plantation owners and merchants, others simply spectators who attended auctions as entertainment, who watched human beings sold and found it no more morally troubling than watching cattle sold at market. At exactly 10:00 a.m., Cyrus Feldman took his position on the platform. Already warm was the November sun, and the air smelled of salt water and tobacco smoke. With furniture Feldman began, several chairs and a dining table from an estate sale. Then livestock, a pair of horses, some chickens, then human beings. For $950 he sold a young man, approximately 20 years old. For $300 he sold an elderly woman, described as an excellent cook. Then for diner he called. Onto the platform she was brought by Silas Burke, who positioned her in the center where everyone could see. In a voice that carried across the crowd, Feldman read from the bill of sale. Female named Diner, approximately 22 years of age, currently with child, estimated 5 months, experienced in domestic service, able to cook, clean, and perform household tasks. Minimum bid 19 cents. Immediately the crowd reacted. 19 cents. Someone called out, "What is wrong with her? Is she diseased?" "Healthy she is. I am informed," Feldman replied. A personal matter between the seller and the property the price reflects, not a deficiency in the property itself. In no one that explanation satisfied. In the economy of slavery, quality price indicated, fundamentally defective, diseased, or dangerous, or mentally unsound a woman offered for 19 cents must be. No rational buyer would risk investment on someone being sold at such an insultingly low price unless they knew something others did not. Immediately several men who had been preparing to bid lost interest. Away they turned, focused their attention on the next items up for auction. But interested 3 men remained. Himself was the first, William Hadley, specifically to acquire Diner, to fulfill his agreement with Elias Cartwright. He had arranged this auction. Near the front of the crowd he stood, waiting for the moment to bid. Someone Hadley had never seen before was the second man. A tall, thin figure dressed in traveling clothes, standing near the back, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Local was the third man, a Savannah plantation owner named Thornton Graves, a mid-sized cotton plantation about 15 miles outside the city Graves owned. And among enslaved people, he was known as one of the cruelest masters in Chatham County. The highest mortality rate of any comparable operation his plantation had. Not because of accidents or disease, but because deliberately Graves worked people to death, calculating that it was more profitable to extract maximum labor over a short period than to maintain workers over decades. Since she appeared on the platform, Graves had been watching Dinah, and something about this situation intrigued him. For 19 cents a healthy pregnant woman being sold, that kind of opportunity did not present itself often. Ready to hear what happens next, are you? Even darker is where this story gets, where we discover what Thornton Graves planned to do with Dinah, and where we meet the mysterious stranger who will change everything. To quiet the murmuring crowd, Cyrus Feldman raised his hand. 19 cents, he called out. Do I have a bid of 19 cents for this property? Immediately William Hadley raised his hand. 19 cents. To look at him, the crowd turned. In Savannah, Hadley was known, a respected merchant with legitimate business interests. A thin veneer of credibility his willingness to bid gave Dinina. If Hadley was interested, as defective as the price suggested, perhaps she was not. But before Feldman could acknowledge the bid, through the crowd another voice cut. 25 cents. Everyone turned. Thornton Graves was the speaker. With his arms crossed he stood, his expression unreadable. Hadley's jaw tightened. Competition he had not anticipated. 50 cents. Hadley countered. Graves smiled, and a pleasant expression it was not. 1 pound. Riveted now was the crowd. Against each other, two men were bidding for a woman being sold at refuge prices. Unusual this was. Something more than a simple transaction this suggested was occurring. Hadley hesitated. To acquire Dinah for Elias Cartwright he had agreed, but to engage in a bidding war he had not agreed. That 800 the debt Elias had forgiven was. If significant money Hadley had to spend to acquire Dinah, at a loss he would be operating. $2, Hadley said, his voice tight. A step forward Thornton Graves took. Enjoying this, he was enjoying the public attention, enjoying the knowledge that he was making Hadley uncomfortable. $5. Graves called out, and a challenge in his tone there was, a dare for Hadley to continue. At Cyrus Feldman Hadley looked, then back at Graves. Risks he was calculating, weighing costs. Finally, his head he shook and stepped back. Had won Graves. $5 once. Feldman called out. 5 twice. Then in the back of the crowd the stranger spoke. $10. Every head turned. Removed his hat now the man had, and visible his face was. Weathered, scarred along the left cheek, his eyes the color of winter sky. In his mid-30s he looked to be, and something about his bearing suggested military service, or perhaps time spent in occupations where violence was routine. Who are you? Feldman asked. Not hostile was the question, simply procedural. Who was bidding? Auctioneers needed to know, needed to verify that buyers had actual means to pay. Jacob Marsh. New to Savannah I am. Business in the city I have and require domestic help. The 10 do you have, Mr. Marsh? Approached the platform Jacob Marsh. Into his coat he reached and withdrew a leather purse. From it one by one he counted out 10 silver dollars, placing them on the podium where Feldman stood. I do. With open hostility, now Thornton Graves was staring at Marsh. Being outbid he did not like. Strangers disrupting what he had assumed would be an easy acquisition he did not like. 15, Graves said. 20, Marsh replied without hesitation. 30 $. Enthralled was the crowd. From 19 cents to $30 in a matter of minutes the price had escalated. No longer about acquiring a pregnant, enslaved woman at bargain prices. Whatever was happening here was a contest of will. This had become a public demonstration of power. At Jacob Marsh Thornton Graves looked, trying to understand who this man was, what his interest could possibly be. Then a decision Graves made. 100 do, gasped the crowd. For a healthy enslaved woman 100 was a reasonable price, but far above what anyone had expected this auction to reach. It was a statement Graves was making. That he would not be outbid. He was showing that he had resources beyond what some traveling stranger could match. Graves's stare Jacob Marsh met. For a long moment, nothing he said. Then he spoke, and with absolute clarity his voice carried across the crowd. 200 dial. Complete was the silence that followed. By any measure, 200 exceeded the rational value of this transaction. Even accounting for Dinah's pregnancy, even assuming the child survived and became valuable property in the future, an investment that would take years to recoup. 200 represented. What was happening Thornton Graves understood. No longer about money this was. About dominance this was, about refusing to yield. And on refusing to yield Graves had built his entire life. 300, Graves said. Hard now was his voice angry. 350, Marsh countered. 400 dive, 500, the amounts climbed. 600 dive, 700 dive, D100 do. When the bidding reached 100,000, quietly left the auction house William Hadley. No interest in participating further he had, and a message he needed to send to Elias Cartwright, explaining that something else entirely, the simple transaction they had arranged had become something complicated and expensive and potentially dangerous. At 200, Thornton Graves stopped bidding, not because funds he lacked, but because suddenly he understood that until Graves bankrupted himself, Jacob Marsh would continue bidding. Not trying to acquire property was this stranger. Trying to destroy whoever opposed him he was. 200 once, Feldman called out. Uncertain now was his voice. Beyond anything in his experience this auction had spiraled. 200 twice. At Thornton Graves he looked, giving the man one final opportunity to bid. His head Graves shook, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. To Mr. Jacob Marsh, sold for 200. In conversation the crowd erupted. 200 for a woman who had been offered at 19 cents. By nightfall through Savannah the story would spread, would become legend, would be repeated and embellished, until the actual facts no one remembered, only the mythology. But Dinina, on that platform standing throughout this entire exchange, her hands still bound, her pregnancy visible beneath the thin dress she wore. Something the crowd did not Dinina understood. That she had just been purchased by a man, willing to spend a fortune to prevent her from being purchased by someone else she understood. And that meant either something about her that made her extraordinarily valuable, Jacob Marsh knew, or something about Thornton Graves that made preventing Graves from acquiring her worth any price he knew. Either possibility terrified her. Within the hour the paperwork was completed. In cash the funds 200 Jacob Marsh paid, counted out in gold coins that from a leather bag he carried he produced. The deed of sale Cyrus Feldman prepared, listing Dinah's description, her approximate age, her condition. At the bottom of the document, in the space for the buyer's signature, in neat, careful script Jacob Marsh wrote his name. His property by law Dinina now was. From across the auction house, Thornton Graves watched this transaction, dark with fury his expression. When to leave Marsh turned, leading Dinah toward the exit, him Graves intercepted. Mr. Marsh, a word. Jacob Marsh stopped. Dinah's arm he did not release. When to face Graves he turned, carefully neutral his expression was. Mr. Graves, a poor investment you have made. Not worth half what you paid that woman is, perhaps. So aggressively then, why did you bid? Because I wanted her, and the means to pay for what I want I have. A step closer Graves took. New to Savannah you are, so perhaps how things work here you do not understand. To certain courtesies certain people are accustomed. When on property I am bidding, generally others defer. Is that so? Marsh said. Mild was his tone, but beneath it something cold there was. Higher than perhaps you should have bid. Facing each other the two men stood, and palpable, dangerous was the tension between them. Finally, back Graves stepped. Your purchase enjoy, Mr. Marsh. Everything you hoped for I am sure you will find her. Away he turned and walked. But in his shoulders the rigidity Dinina could see, in his movements the barely contained violence. Over this was not. Quietly men like Thornton Graves did not accept public humiliation. Out of the auction house and into the street Jacob Marsh led Dinina. High now was the November sun, and with midday activity the city was busy. Quickly Marsh walked, not roughly, but with purpose. As though distance between himself and the auction house he wanted to put as rapidly as possible. 2 blocks away they reached a wagon parked. A simple farm cart with a canvas cover. Into the back Marsh helped Dinina climb, his touch impersonal but not cruel. Then onto the driver's bench he climbed, took up the reins, and forward urged the horse. Through Savannah's streets in silence they rode, past storefronts and residences, past the city market where vendors sold vegetables and fish, past the cathedral with its Spanish architecture, past the boundary where urban development gave way to forest and farmland. Only when well beyond the city limits they were, when to a dirt path surrounded by pine trees and palmetto scrub the road had narrowed, did Jacob Marsh finally speak. Jacob Marsh is my name. Call me that you will, or sir you will call me, whichever you prefer. Going to hurt you I am not. Going to sell you I am not, and force myself on you I am not going to. Do you understand? Nothing, Dinina said. Promises before she had heard. Many things to gain compliance men said she had learned, that without actions to support them words meant nothing. Marsh continued. Do not trust me, I know you do. Trust me, I would not either if in your position I were. But carefully I need you to listen, because on what happens over the next few days your life and the life of your child depends. Navigating the wagon around a fallen branch, he paused. To die here Elias Cartwright sent you. Not immediately, not obviously, but circumstances he arranged to ensure that with someone who would work you to death or worse you would end up. To attract exactly one type of buyer the 19-cent minimum price was designed. Men like Thornton Graves. Men who purchase damaged property because through cruelty they know they can extract value before the property is used up completely. Cold ran Dinina's blood. How about Elias do you know? A great deal about Elias Cartwright I know, Marsh said. Repeatedly over a period of years he raped you I know. At least one child with you he fathered I know, a daughter named Ruth. To erase evidence of his crimes he sold that child I know. And here he sent you to insure to Charleston to cause him embarrassment you would never return I know. Behind her eyes Dinina felt tears burning, but fall she refused to let them. Weakness crying was, and weakness she could not afford. Who are you? A friend, Marsh said. Or at least a friend of people who were your friends. Into his coat he reached and withdrew a folded piece of paper. From the road, without taking his eyes, back to Dinina he handed it. Read it. With trembling hands Dinah unfolded the paper. Unfamiliar was the handwriting, but catch her breath the words made. Dinina, if reading this you are, by Jacob Marsh you have been purchased, and that means the first part of our plan succeeded. With people who help enslaved people reach freedom, Jacob works. For your arrival in Savannah for 3 months, he has been preparing. Trust him. What he says do. To help you his life he is risking. Unsigned the letter was, but at the bottom, carefully drawn, a small symbol there was. A bird in flight, wings spread wide. Immediately Dinah recognized it. Her mother had taught her the mark was. For generations women in their family had used the mark to identify themselves to each other, to say, "Here I am. With you I am. Not forgotten I have." Where did you get this? Dinina whispered. From a woman in Charleston named Bethy. Elderly she is. As a cook in Elias Cartwright's household she works. For years she has been watching you, watching what Elias did to you. What Constance allowed to happen. When to Savannah you were being sent, she learned. People she knew she contacted. People who operate what the Underground Railroad we call. Me those people contacted. Reeled Diner's mind. Bethy. For decades part of the Cartwright household, Bethy had been so old and seemingly harmless that as a person at all white people stopped seeing her simply as furniture that occasionally moved and performed tasks. But watching Bethy had been to networks Diner had never suspected existed. She had been connected. This rescued she had arranged. The Underground Railroad. Dinina said slowly. Stories I have heard. True stories are. Marsh confirmed. People there are, black and white, who to free states, to Canada, to places where property rights in human beings the law does not recognize, help enslaved people escape. Dangerous it is, illegal, and careful planning it requires. But possible it is. That you are going to help me escape, you are saying. That I am going to try, I am saying. On many factors whether we succeed depends, most of which outside my control are. The most immediate danger is Thornton Graves. About him what? On the reins Marsh's hands tightened. Not just a cruel plantation owner Graves is. A slave catcher also he is. Hunting fugitives he makes additional income, for reward money returning them to their owners. Throughout Georgia and South Carolina connections he has. Men who owe him favors, men who if he asks will help him. And publicly I just humiliated him, to prevent him from acquiring you once earned 200 I spent. Why he will want to know. Investigate he will, and that I am involved with the Underground Railroad if he discovers. After both of us he will come. Then leave we need to. Dinina said. Now, tonight go we need to, as far and as fast as possible.
We cannot.
Marsh said. Not yet. Why not? Watching the roads out of Savannah Graves will be. At checkpoints men he will have asking questions, looking for anyone matching our descriptions. Immediately if we run, within 2 days caught we will be. Then what do? In plain sight we hide. Onto a smaller path, barely visible through the underbrush. Marsh turned the wagon. To a place Graves would never think to look we go, and until he stops watching so carefully we wait. Then we move. Where is this place? See you will. Deeper into the forest they traveled, following paths that as animal trails more than as roads meant for wagons seemed to exist. Through the canopy the afternoon light filtered in dusty shafts, and of decaying vegetation and standing water the air smelled. Finally, after nearly an hour of slow progress, into a clearing they emerged. In the center a cabin stood, small and weathered, its walls made of rough, hewn logs, its roof covered with wooden shingles that had turned gray with age. From a stone chimney smoke rose, indicating someone was inside. The wagon Marsh stopped and climbed down. Descend he helped Diner, then toward the cabin door he led her. Before knock he could, the door opened. Perhaps 50 years old the woman who stood in the doorway was, her hair wrapped in a blue cloth, her dress simple but clean. Dark was her skin, sharp and assessing her eyes. When Dinina she saw, her expression softened. Got her you did. I did. More than expected trouble there was, Marsh said. At the auction Thornton Graves was. Hardened the woman's face. Graves. A demon that man is. You did he see. Bid against him and win he saw me do. My face he knows, that I exist he knows. Anything else whether he knows remains to be seen. Aside the woman stepped, gesturing for them to enter. Larger than it appeared from outside the cabin was inside. In the hearth a fire burned, and of cooking the room smelled, something with beans and salt pork. A table there was, several chairs, a bed in the corner. At the table another woman younger, perhaps 30, sat mending a shirt. When Dinina entered she looked up and widened her eyes. Lord have mercy. Just a child she is. 22 Dinina is, Marsh said. Stronger than she looks she is. To Diner the older woman moved, took her hands, with the intensity of someone looking for signs of illness or injury, examined her face. "Your name, child, what is it?" "Dinah." "Sarah, I am." "Hannah, this is my daughter. Safe here you are. About this cabin no one knows except people we trust. With us you will stay until the next part of your journey Jacob can arrange." "How long will that be?" Dinina asked. "Days? Possibly weeks," Marsh said. "On Thornton Graves it depends. On how aggressively this he pursues. On how quickly safe passage north I can arrange." A wash over her, Dinina felt exhaustion, the accumulated weight of fear and uncertainty, and down on her pressing the sheer physical demands of pregnancy. This Sarah seemed to sense. To the bed she guided Dinina. "Rest now you. Later talk we will. When you are ready, food there is. And safe you are." Again that word, safe. Believe it, Dinina wanted to. Trust that genuine these strangers, who claimed to be helping her, where she wanted to. But a luxury enslaved people could not afford to assume safety was. On the bed she lay down, and despite her fear, despite everything, within minutes sleep pulled her under. When she woke, outside dark it was. Rebuilt the fire had been, and warm the cabin was. At the table Sarah and Hannah sat, in low voices talking. Gone Jacob Marsh was. "Where is he?" Dinina asked, sitting up. "An hour ago he left," Sarah said. "In Savannah, arrangements he has to make. People to contact. Tomorrow or the day after he will return. In the meantime, with us you are." Dinina stood, moved to the table. Toward her Sarah pushed a bowl, beans and cornbread and a piece of salt pork. "Eat, for what is coming strength you need." "What is coming?" Dinina asked. "The truth," Hannah said. Quiet, but firm her voice was. "Why about who you are the truth? Why really here Elias Cartwright sent you? And why to save you first and 200 Jacob Marsh spent? Because just about saving you it was not, Dinina. About stopping something much worse it was." Despite the fire's warmth, Dinina felt cold. "What are you talking about?" A glance Sarah and Hannah exchanged. Then Sarah spoke, and tilt Dinina's world what she said made. "Simply to get rid of you. Elias Cartwright did not send you to Savannah. Because he knew Thornton Graves would buy you, he sent you here. And what Graves does to pregnant women he acquires at auction he knew. A pattern he has, a system, and his next victim you were supposed to be. To bring you stories like this, Tartaria Codex 777 exists. The mechanisms of historical evil stories that expose. The past stay buried stories that refuse to let. What we do here, if you appreciate, that like button hit. With someone who needs to hear this truth, this video share. And so you never miss a story, subscribe. Now, what Sarah and Hannah know about Thornton Graves, let's discover. And why Dinina's pregnancy made her a target for something even worse than slavery itself. To a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin Sarah stood and moved. She opened it, and withdrew a leather-bound journal. Yellowed with age its pages. To the table she brought it, and in front of Dinina placed it. To a woman named Abigail this journal belonged. 2 years ago of consumption she died. But before she died, everything she knew she wrote down. Everything about what on Thornton Graves's plantation happens she had witnessed. To a marked page Sarah opened the journal. Read it. At the careful handwriting Dinina looked down. Dated, the entries were organized chronologically. In the voice of someone who knew for a future that might never come, she was documenting evidence written. Dated March 1845, the first entry Dinah read was, "Today, another one I saw them bring in. Rachel her name is. Pregnant she is, maybe 6 months. And at auction they bought her for almost nothing. Because difficult the seller said she was. In the old tobacco barn at the edge of the north field, separate from the rest of us, Mr. Graves keeps her. Near there I'm not allowed. None of us are. But at night crying I can hear her." The next entry, April 1845, "Gone Rachel is. In childbirth she died, they say, that both she and the baby died, and past the tree line somewhere they buried them. But believe it, I do not. 2 nights ago crying I heard the baby. Clear as anything I heard it, a newborn's cry. And then suddenly stop I heard it, like someone made it stop. And Rachel. 3 days ago, when from the barn to the main house, they moved her, I saw her. Like someone about to give birth, she did not look. Like someone who had already given birth she looked, and very wrong something had gone. Shook Dinina's hands as another page she turned. Another entry, June 1846. A new one now there is. Margaret her name is, same as before. Pregnant, bought cheap, kept separate. Every night Mr. Graves visits the barn. What there he does I do not know, but Margaret screams, and to help her no one is allowed. Like it is not happening, Mrs. Graves acts like wind or animals, those screams are just. But all of us hear it, all of us know. Another entry, August 1846. Last week Margaret disappeared. Ran away they say she did, but no sense that makes. 8 months pregnant and barely could walk she was. Run where would she? Survive how would she? No, run she did not. To her something happened. Same as Rachel. Same as the one before Rachel whose name I never learned. A pattern this is. Systematic this is. And stops it no one because money and power Mr. Graves has, and instead of us the law protects him. At Sarah, Dinina looked up. What is this? To these women what was Graves doing? Exactly we do not know, Sarah said. But enough we know. Over the past 10 years, at least 7 pregnant women at auction Graves has purchased, always for suspiciously low prices. Always women who, because of personal disputes or complications with their previous owners, were being sold. To his plantation he takes them. Isolated keeps them, and within months they disappear. In childbirth some are reported as dying. To have run away others are claimed. But again ever seen none of them are. And the babies, Dinina whispered. To the babies what happens? Cannot answer, that is the question we. Hannah said. Infants crying some of the women who work at Graves's plantation have reported hearing, but the children they never see, as completely as their mothers, as though the babies vanish it is. Rising, Dinina felt nausea. About Rachel and Margaret, and the unnamed woman before them she thought. About 7 women over 10 years she thought. About 7 babies who had simply disappeared she thought. Of monster what kind does this? The journal Sarah closed. By law a monster protected. Wealthy Thornton Graves is, in certain circles respected, a member of the Savannah Planters Association. His taxes he pays, church he attends, to civic projects he contributes, and because wealthy and white and male he is, when on his property enslaved women disappear him no one questions. To dispose of his property, however, he sees fit, the law assumes he has the right. But Jacob stopped him. Dinina said, from buying me Jacob prevented Graves. Yes, and in doing so, as targets both of you he marked. Who Jacob is Graves will want to know. Why he interfered. What in you his interest could possibly be. And when investigating Graves starts, that Jacob with the Underground Railroad works he will eventually discover. At that point, in immediate danger both your lives will be. Then tonight leave we need to. Dinina said, rising her voice. Before Graves finds us run we need to. Her head Sarah shook. Exactly what Graves expects running is. Watching the roadsmen he will have. Checking passes. Questioning anyone who looks suspicious. Traveling with a pregnant black woman, a white man. Immediately attention that will attract. Indefinitely here we cannot stay. Hannah added, for now safe this cabin is, but invisible it is not. About this place people know, not many, but enough. In the right communities asking questions if Graves starts, eventually talk someone will. So what do we do? Dinina asked. For Jacob to return we wait, Sarah said. On something he is working, a plan that north safely will get you. but time and coordination it requires. Until then, you rest, you eat, of yourself and that baby you take care. Because once moving you start, no stopping there will be, no safety, just constant travel until into free territory you cross. And if caught we are, if caught you are, to Elias Cartwright you will be returned, and another opportunity to escape he will ensure you never have. If caught Jacob is, for theft and conspiracy tried he will be, and hang he will. The stakes those are. What we are risking, that is. This information Dinina absorbed. On her behalf, the full weight of what these people were attempting. Everything they were risking, freedom, safety, their lives, to help someone they barely knew. Why? Dina asked. This why would you do? Wasn't 200 why would Jacob spend? Here why would you hide me? For me so much why would any of you risk? Across the table Sarah reached and Dinah's hand took. Because right it is. Because evil the system that allows men like Elias Cartwright and Thornton Graves to exist is. And because if resist we do not, if in whatever small ways we can fight we do not, then in that evil complicit we are. The first person we have helped you are not, and the last you will not be. Over the years dozens of fugitives this cabin has sheltered. People escaping, people heading north, people seeking freedom. Dangerous work it is, but necessary work it is. In Sarah's cabin 3 days Dinina spent. 3 days of relative peace that, given everything that had preceded them, felt surreal. Meals prepared with care she ate. In a real bed she slept. Inside her with increasing strength the baby move she felt. With a kindness that seemed almost incomprehensible Sarah and Hannah treated her. Kindness without expectation of service or submission. Kindness offered simply because they believed she deserved it. On the morning of the 4th day, Jacob Marsh returned. Just after dawn he arrived. Lathered with sweat his horse, drawn with exhaustion his face. Through the night he had been riding, and when the cabin he entered, something had changed. Sarah immediately knew. What happened? Sarah asked. Graves knows, Marsh said. Into one of the chairs heavily he sat. The cup of water Hannah offered him he accepted. Not who I claim to be I am he knows. All over Savannah asking questions he has been, to people showing my description, for information offering money. How much does he know? Hannah asked. To be dangerous enough. Cash for diner I paid he knows, which beyond what a normal traveler would carry resources suggests. Immediately after the auction Savannah, I left he knows, which for business in the city domestic help I did not actually need suggests, and that at any hotel or boarding house in Savannah no one named Jacob Marsh has registered he has discovered, which false the name is suggests. Is it? Dinina asked. Your real name is Jacob Marsh. For a long moment Marsh looked at her, then his head he shook. No. Jacob Brennan my real name is. From Pennsylvania originally I am. And for the past 6 years with an organization dedicated to helping enslaved people reach freedom I have been working. Across multiple states we operate, using false identities, safe houses, and carefully planned routes to move people north. To Savannah specifically I came because about you information we received. About what planning Elias Cartwright was about of acquiring and murdering pregnant women Thornton Graves's pattern. That information how did you receive? Dinina asked. From Bethy, the woman who in Cartwright's household worked. To our network for over a decade she has been connected. When to Savannah Elias was sending you she learned. When to deliver you to Graves the auction was arranged specifically she discovered. Through channels we have established an urgent message she sent. To intervene she asked us, if possible to save you. And you came? Dinina said. One's 200 you spent. For someone you had never met everything you risked. Difficult to read Brennan's expression was, I came because beyond even the considerable evil of slavery itself, what Graves does. What for years he has been doing represents evil. With complete impunity to torture and murder women the system allows him. If nothing we do, continue he will. If you we save, not just your life we save, but potentially the lives of future women he would have targeted. Charity it is not, Dinina. Resistance it is. To the window looking out at the forest Sarah moved. Who you are if Graves knows, that with the railroad you work if he knows, then actively hunting you he will be. With Dinina you cannot travel. More visible, more vulnerable your presence will make her. I know, Brennan said. Changed the plan has that is why. Changed how? Dinina asked, cold fear in her stomach settling. North taking you I am, but directly not, and alone not. Better suited for this than I am people there are. People who more intimately know the routes, who connections I lack have. For you to meet a conductor named Thomas Garrett I am arranging. Out of Wilmington, Delaware he operates, and successfully over 200 people to freedom he has guided. But hundreds of miles from here Wilmington is, Hannah said. Reach him how will she? By water, Brennan said. Savannah's port in 5 days a ship is leaving. A merchant vessel traveling to Philadelphia. To our cause sympathetic the captain is. To hide Dinah in the cargo hold he has agreed. To transport her as far as Wilmington, where waiting Garrett will be. Once him she reaches, the rest of the way to Canada he will take her. And you? Sarah asked. To you what happens? Disappear I do, other identities I have, other places I can go. Jacob Marsh Graves will hunt, but to exist Jacob Marsh will cease. Simply vanish the man he is looking for will. To process this information Dinina tried. Alone she would be traveling, in the cargo hold of a ship hidden. To strangers whose only connection to her was a shared commitment to destroying the system that enslaved her life trusting. Terrifying it was, but also her only chance it was. For the ship when do I leave? Dina asked. Tomorrow night. After dark move we will. Through routes Graves will not be watching travel. Expecting you the captain is, and below deck a hiding place he has prepared where for the duration of the voyage you will remain. Uncomfortable it will be, even dangerous perhaps if rough the weather turns, but safer than traveling overland where influence Graves has it is. About my baby what? Dinina said, to her stomach her hand moving instinctively. During the voyage if into labor I go what? With such situations experience the captain has, Brennan said, though uncertainty his voice carried. Before pregnant women he has carried, and if necessary how to assist he knows. But to you lie I will not, Dinina. Dangerous at sea childbirth is. If complications arise, limited medical help will be. I understand. Dina said, though fully she did not understand. Fully comprehend the risk she was about to accept she could not. But with absolute certainty one thing she knew. In Georgia staying meant death, if not from Graves, then from someone like him, if not immediately, then eventually, if not for her, then for her child. At least possibility running north offered however slim. To Dinah Sarah moved and embraced her. Than you know braver you are, child. Survive this you are going to. Both of you, you and that baby. Reach freedom you are going to. And when you do, remember us. Remember that people who fought for you there were. That night, sleep Dinina could not. In the darkness she lay, to Sarah's breathing listening. To the sounds of the forest outside, to within her body the movement of her child. About Ruth she thought. 2 years earlier her daughter sold away. Now where that child was she wondered, alive whether she was, at all her mother whether she remembered. About the 7 women who by Thornton Graves had been purchased, she thought. 7 women whose names as thoroughly as their bodies had been erased from the world, from history, had been erased. About Elias Cartwright she thought. About the man who repeatedly had raped her. and then for her to be murdered to protect his reputation had arranged. And about the people helping her, she thought Bethy in Charleston, Jacob Brennan risking his life, Sarah and Hannah opening their home, a ship captain she had never met agreeing to hide her, Thomas Garrett waiting in Delaware to guide her to Canada. All of them by networks of resistance connected, by shared commitment to undermining the system that made Elias Cartwright and Thornton Graves possible. Beautiful and tragic in equal measure it was, this underground web of humanity asserting itself against inhuman laws. The next evening, as over the forest darkness settled, the wagon Jacob Brennan prepared. With canvas he covered Dinah, arranging it as though supplies rather than a human being he was transporting. Their goodbyes Sarah and Hannah said, fierce and final their embraces. As though alive this might be the last time they saw Dinina they understood. 4 hours to Savannah the journey took, slowly along back roads, traveling, avoiding main thoroughfares where checkpoints might be established. Almost nothing during the trip, Brennan said. Entirely on watching for signs of danger, his attention focused. For riders who might be Graves's men, for any indication they were being followed. Just before midnight the waterfront they reached. Quieter at this hour the docks were, but not empty. Onto ships dock workers loaded cargo, preparing for dawn departures. Between vessels sailors moved. With lanterns night watchmen patrolled. To a warehouse near the far end of the wharf Brennan guided the wagon. A large wooden structure that of tar and rope and salt water smelled. Beside a side door he stopped the wagon, then climbed down and from beneath the canvas helped Dinina emerge. From the shadows a man appeared, tall and lean, perhaps 50 years old, by years at sea his face weathered. "Brennan you are," the man said. "I am. And this is Dinah." The captain, Samuel Porter his name was, with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been calculation, studied Dinah. "Further along than I expected she is. 5 months," Brennan said. "A problem will that be? Risk it increases, but manageable it is. Come. Before the watch rotation changes aboard, we need to get her." Quickly they moved through the warehouse and out onto the dock. A 3-masted merchant vessel the ship was, perhaps 90 feet long, dark with age and weather its hull. To the dock, to the deck a gangplank connected, and without hesitation up it Porter led them. Once aboard, below deck he guided them, down a narrow ladder into the cargo hold. Cramped and dark the space was, filled with crates and barrels and coils of rope. Of mildew and something organic that might have been rotting fruit the air smelled. To the far end of the hold Porter moved, and aside several crates pulled, revealing behind them a small space, perhaps 5 feet by 3 feet, barely large enough for a person to lie down. "Where for the duration of the voyage you will stay this is," Porter said. "Twice daily food and water I will bring you. But leave this space you cannot. Noise you cannot make. Yourself to be discovered you cannot allow. If the crew finds you, protect you I cannot. Approximately 7 days the voyage will take, depending on weather and wind. Endure that can you." At the cramped space Dinina looked, at the darkness, at the impossibility of what was being asked. Then her head she nodded. "Endure it I can." "Good," Porter said. "When Wilmington we reach, to you Thomas Garrett I will bring. From there he will take you. Until then, no one except me you trust. No sound you make, and that the weather holds you pray." Forward Brennan stepped. Into his coat he reached and a small cloth bundle withdrew. Money inside there was, perhaps the 50 W's in various denominations. "For you this is," he said, into Dinah's hands pressing it. "For when Canada you reach. For starting your new life." "Cannot I?" Dinina whispered. "Too much it is." "Can you, and will you?" Brennan said. Firm his voice was. "Survive this you are going to Dinina. Reach freedom you are going to. And when you do, For yourself and your child, a life you are going to build. A life where owns you no one, where your children no one can take, where fully human under the law you are. For that is what we are fighting. Risk everything, that is why we. So take the money, take your freedom, and live. Streaming down her face, Dinina felt tears she could no longer hold back. Brennan she embraced, this stranger who had saved her life. This man whose real name only yesterday she had learned. This person who represented everything good that even in the midst of systematic evil could exist. Thank you, she whispered. For seeing me as human, thank you. For a moment Brennan held her, then back he stepped. Now go, hide yourself, and until Porter tells you safe it is, do not emerge. Into the small space behind the crates Dinina climbed. To conceal her completely, Porter arranged the boxes, for air circulation only a small gap leaving. Absolute the darkness was. In low voices Brennan and Porter speaking she heard, on the ladder footsteps heard, as to the deck they returned. Around her the sounds of the ship settling heard. Then silence, only by the creaking of wood, and the distant sound of water against the hull broken. Alone now she was, truly alone, in darkness hiding, to people she barely knew, her life trusting. A child who would either free be born, or into slavery be born carrying, depending on whether this desperate plan succeeded. At dawn the ship departed. Change the motion Dinina felt, begin to move the vessel felt. The gentle rocking that meant leaving the dock they were felt. Leaving Georgia, leaving behind everything she had ever known. For the first 2 days, uneventful the voyage was. As promised, Porter brought food and water. Stale bread and dried meat and warm water that of wood tasted. Little he spoke, simply the provisions he handed her. If she was managing, asked, then departed. Unbearably cramped the space was, and from the inability to stretch or move freely Dinah's body ached. Everything worse her pregnancy made. Constant the pressure on her bladder. Frequent but impossible the need to shift position. But she endured, because all she had ever known endurance was, because early enslaved people learned that the intolerable survival meant tolerating, that any temporary suffering freedom was worth. On the 3rd day, the weather changed. In the distance Dinina heard thunder, more violently begin to pitch the ship felt. With full force that afternoon the storm hit, into violent heaving the gentle rocking transforming. Chaos the cargo hold became, with each massive wave crates shifting, barrels rolling, ropes swinging. Into the corner of her hiding space Dinina pressed herself, protectively around her stomach her arms wrapped. Enough the crates concealing her would not shift to expose her or crush her praying. Through the night and into the following morning the storm lasted. During those hours, beyond anything she had known before, Dinina experienced fear. Rape she had survived, the sale of her child she had survived, for 19 cents being sold herself she had survived. But different this was. Trying to kill her nature itself this was. Water and wind indifferent to human suffering, to human law, to human evil. If the ship sank, in this hold she would drown, behind crates trapped, even to attempt survival unable. With her child would die, both of them as thoroughly erased as the 7 women Thornton Graves had murdered. When finally the storm broke, when to something resembling normal the motion of the ship returned, to appear with food and water, Dinina waited for Porter. But come he did not. The morning passed, then afternoon, then evening. No food, no water, no contact. With thirst Dinah's throat burned, with hunger her stomach cramped. To remain calm she tried, to tell herself tried that simply delayed Porter was, that requiring his attention elsewhere, on the ship the storm had created problems. But as without provisions the 2nd day began. To set in panic started. To Porter had something happened. During the storm had he been injured? Or worse, helping her had he been discovered. About her presence had the crew found out. On the third day, without food or water, that here she might die, Dinina began to accept. Weak she was, lightheaded, cracked and bleeding her lips. Less frequently now the baby moved, as though the approaching end it too sensed. About praying she thought, but to whom? To a God who had allowed her to be enslaved, to be raped, to be sold like livestock. Such a world what God would sanction? Then on the ladder footsteps she heard, through the cargo hold heard someone moving. Please let it be Porter, she thought. Please let it be help and not discovery. Shifted the crates in front of her hiding space, and in painful after days of darkness light flooded, a face appeared, but not Porter's. A younger man it was, perhaps 25, with red hair and a sailor's weathered skin. When her he saw, widened his eyes. Sweet Jesus, he whispered. Actually someone here there is. Porter said there might be, but him I did not believe. To speak Dinina tried, but too dry her throat was. The sailor, Michael his name was, to her lips a canteen lifted. Small sips, he said. Too long without water you have gone. Slowly drink you need to, or vomit you will. Dinina drank, and ever tasted the most beautiful thing she had water was. Where is Porter? To ask she managed. Dead, Michael said. Grim his voice was. During the storm he fell. His neck he broke. Yesterday morning at sea we buried him. Before he died about you he told me. Where hidden you were he told me. Alive until Wilmington we reached I needed to keep you he told me. So here I am, going to help me you are. Dinina asked, disbelieving. Michael shrugged. A good man Porter was. Worth saving if he thought you were. Enough for me that is. Besides, for the system that makes people property no love I have. Irish my father was. To America to escape famine came. In factories to death worked himself. What it means to be disposable to rich men I know. So yes, help you I am going to. Tomorrow Wilmington we reach. Until then, hidden you stay. Quiet you stay. Alive you stay. Understand? Dinina nodded. From his coat Michael produced food. Hard biscuits and cheese. Slowly eat, he instructed. Time to adjust your stomach needs. Then the crates he repositioned, concealing her once more, and departed. The following afternoon Wilmington the ship reached. The sounds of docking Dinina heard, of sailors shouting instructions, of cargo being unloaded. In her hiding place she waited, tense every muscle. Return whether Michael would wondering. There actually whether Thomas Garrett would be wondering. This final stage of the journey succeed whether would wondering, or so far she had come only at the last moment to be captured. Hours passed. Diminished the sounds of activity. Finally, footsteps approached, and aside the crates moved. Michael's face appeared, and beside him another man was, older, perhaps 60, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. Diner you are, the older man said. Thomas Garrett I am. That you would be arriving Jacob Brennan sent word. The rest of the way north to take you I am here. Walk can you? To stand Dinina tried. But her weight her legs would not support. Beyond what she had realized, days of confinement and dehydration had weakened her. Carefully Garrett and Michael lifted her, up the ladder and onto the deck carried her. Setting the sun was, and water made Diner's eyes the light. The Wilmington docks she could see, beyond buildings could see. For the first time in her life free territory could see. Quickly move we need to, Garrett said. In this city people there are who for reward money gladly south would return you. Waiting my wagon is. Tonight we travel. Off the ship and into a waiting wagon they carried Dinina. With blankets Garrett covered her, and through Wilmington's streets they began to move. Where going are we? Dinina asked. First to a safe house, where rest and recover your strength you can. Then north through Pennsylvania and New York to Canada. Weeks the journey will take, possibly months. depending on your condition and the baby. But there get you we will, Dinina. Anyone I have guided lost I have never, and with you start I do not intend to. Her eyes, Dinina, closed. The smallest measure of hope allowed herself to feel. The first real hope in years she had experienced. Yet free she was not, legally not, safely not. But then she had ever been closer she was. And if tomorrow she died, at least knowing she had tried she would die, knowing she had resisted, knowing that everything to help her people had risked, because her life mattered they believed, because evil and worth fighting the system that enslaved her was they believed. That night, in a small house on the outskirts of Wilmington, for the first time in over a week in a real bed Dinina slept. Warm food prepared by Garrett's wife she ate. A woman named Rachel, who with the same kindness Sarah and Hannah had shown treated her. And for the first time since with Elias Cart, Wright's child learning she was pregnant. A future Dinina allowed herself to imagine. A future where free her baby would grow up, where them no one could sell, where fully human under the law they would be. Fragile hope it was, easily destroyed. But hope none of the less it was, and the most dangerous and necessary thing an enslaved person could possess hope. Dinina was learning, was. 7 weeks Diner's journey from Wilmington to the Canadian border took. 7 weeks of at night through forests and farmland traveling. 7 weeks of in barns and cellars and attics hiding. 7 weeks of strangers, trusting whose only connection to her was a shared belief that an abomination requiring resistance slavery was. Through Pennsylvania Thomas Garrett guided her, from one conductor to another passing her. Only what they needed to know each person in the chain knowing. Enough to help, but not enough if they were caught to endanger the entire network. In a farmhouse outside Philadelphia, a Quaker family named Coleman Dinina met who new clothes gave her, sturdy boots, a warm coat for the journey ahead. In Rochester, New York, 3 days with Frederick Douglass himself she stayed, the famous abolitionist who years earlier had escaped slavery, and now to helping others achieve the same freedom, dedicated his life. About the importance of telling her story once safety she reached, Douglass spoke to her. Of documenting what to her had been done. Of bearing witness, so that beyond the sanitized versions slaveholders, preferred to present future generations, would understand the reality of slavery. An act of resistance your survival is, Douglass told her. A defeat for Elias Cartwright, for Thornton Graves. For every person who from your bondage profited every day you live free is. By remaining silent that victory do not waste. By the time in late January of 1850, the Canadian border Dinina reached, 8 months pregnant she was, beyond measure exhausted but alive. On a night so cold frozen solid the ground was, visible in the frigid air her breath, into Ontario she crossed. The moment onto Canadian soil she stepped, to her knees she fell. Not from weakness, though weak she was, but from the overwhelming realization that actually done it she had, escaped she had, free she was. Not just spiritually or morally free, but legally free, under the protection of a government that in human beings' property rights did not recognize. Beside her Thomas Garrett knelt. Made it you did, Dinina. Safe now you are. Take you back no one can. Ownership of you or your child no one can claim. Free you are. Dinina wept, from somewhere deep inside her great racking sobs that came. From the place where years of grief and rage and fear she had buried. For herself she wept, for Ruth, for her mother Patience. For the 7 women Thornton Graves had murdered, for still enslaved in the South every person. For the sheer cruelty of a world that such desperate measures simply to be recognized as human required. To her feet Garrett helped her, and the final mile to a settlement of formerly enslaved people who near the border a community had established they walked. Dawn the settlement was called, and of approximately 200 people who had escaped slavery, and now as farmers, craftspeople, teachers' lives were building it consisted. With open arms they welcomed Dinina, with food and shelter, and the kind of safety she had never known. 3 weeks later, on February 19, 1850, to a son Dinina gave birth. Difficult the labor was, nearly 18 hours lasting. But a midwife named Clara, herself a former enslaved person from Virginia, with patience and skill through it guided Dinina. When finally the baby emerged, his fury at the world screaming, him Dinina held, and inside her felt something shift. Something that joy might have been or terror at the responsibility of in a world that still wanted to enslave him. Raising a free child might have been. Him what will you name? Clara asked. At her son's face Dinina looked down, at waving his tiny fists. At in his features written the undeniable evidence that Elias Cartwright was his father. For a moment after someone she had loved him naming she considered. After her mother, or after William, the person his father she might have wanted to be. But then about all the people who to reach this moment had helped her she thought, about all the people who everything had risked, and her decision she made. Jacob his name is, she said. After Jacob Brennan, the man whom my life saved. Clara smiled. A good name Jacob is, a strong name. Free that boy is going to grow up diner. Opportunities you never had he is going to have. In a world where him no one owns he is going to live. How many people to give him that chance fought make sure he knows. I will. Dinina promised. Everything I will tell him. For 3 years in Dawn Dinina lived. As a seamstress working and to adjust to freedom, helping other newly arrived fugitives. More fluently to read, with help from a teacher in the settlement she learned. And down her story she began writing. Documenting what to her Elias Cartwright had done, what to do Thornton Graves had planned, how her life the Underground Railroad had saved. In 1853, a man named Samuel Richards she married. A blacksmith who 5 years earlier from Maryland had escaped. Kind and patient Samuel was, and that diner's past was not something that could be forgotten or erased he understood, but something that to be honored and remembered needed. Together 2 more children they had, both daughters, and with the understanding that with the courage and sacrifice of people who believed justice mattered more than law, their freedom had been purchased. All 3 children they raised. But about Ruth Dinina never forgot, her first daughter, the child in 1847 Elias Cartwright had sold. Years she spent trying to locate her. To abolitionists in the South writing letters, asking if about a girl sold in Charleston anyone had information. A girl who by 1850 approximately 10 years old would be. A girl with light skin and a name that still Ruth might or might not be. Consumed her the search. An obsession became that gently Samuel tried to temper, but ultimately supported, because whole no mother could be while lost her child remained he understood. In 1856, from a Quaker missionary in South Carolina, a letter Dinina received. About a girl matching Ruth's description, who on a plantation outside Charleston had been working. The letter contained information. With the girl contact the missionary had managed to make, had confirmed Ruth her original name was, had learned that despite being only 4 years old, when they were separated her mother she remembered. Alive Ruth was, the missionary wrote. Relatively healthy, but still enslaved. A decision that terrified Samuel and everyone who knew her Dinina made. Back she decided to go, not permanently, but a rescue to attempt. To use to now save her daughter the same Underground Railroad network that had saved her. Extraordinarily dangerous it was, as a formerly enslaved person to the South returning. Ownership any white person who recognized her could claim, before a magistrate could drag her, and that she was fugitive property present evidence. But about the danger Dinina did not care. Her daughter Ruth was, and already too many years she had lost. In the summer of 1856, with two experienced conductors, South Dinina traveled, men who to freedom had guided dozens of people, and who the routes, the safe houses, the strategies for without detection, moving through hostile territory understood. In August, South Carolina, they reached, with the missionary made contact, and learned that on a small farm owned by a widow named Margaret Foster, now working Ruth, was. For a moonless night, in early September, the rescue was planned. After midnight, Dinah and the conductors approached the farm. In a small cabin with 3 other enslaved women, Ruth sleeping found, and gently woke her. Now 13 years old, Ruth at Dinina with wide eyes stared. "Know you, do I?" Ruth whispered. "Your mother I am," Dinah said, breaking her voice. "For you back I came. Never stop looking, I promised myself I would, and that promise I kept. Now leave here, we are going. North go we are going, and together free be we are going." To cry Ruth began, and so did Dinina. And that critical time was that before anyone discovered they were gone immediately, they needed to move. The 2 conductors had to remind them. By late October, back to Canada they made it. The same routes traveling Dinina had used 6 years earlier, on the same network of brave people who sheltered fugitives, relying. When finally the border they crossed and dawn reached, when to Jacob and Samuel and her daughters, Dinina was able to introduce Ruth. When safe now, she was able to tell Ruth that ever again no one would take her. Something she had not felt since before Elias Cartwright first raped her. Dinina felt. Complete she felt. Not easy the years that followed were. Trauma freedom did not erase. Wounds that ran so deep did not heal. But of building years they were, of creating a life defined by choice rather than coercion, of children raising who their history and their responsibility to for those still enslaved fight understood. With the Underground Railroad, Dinina continued to work, continued to help other fugitives, continued to document stories that needed to be told. And about Thornton Graves she never stopped thinking. About the 7 women he had murdered, about the evil that when the law, instead of holding them accountable, protected the men, could commit. After she escaped his pattern, Graves had continued whether she wondered, purchased and disappeared other women had been whether, stop him ever anyone would weather. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, the answer came, when Savannah Union forces occupied a regiment of black soldiers, formerly enslaved men now for their freedom fighting, at various plantations in Chatham County were stationed. To Thornton Graves one of those plantations belonged. Though ahead of Union advancement south, Graves himself had fled, to avoid capture, abandoning his property. The soldiers who occupied Graves's plantation, the property, began exploring, searching for hidden valuables, for weapons, for anything that to the Union cause might be useful. A sergeant named Isaiah Freeman, a man who 3 years earlier from slavery in Alabama had escaped and to fight against the system that had enslaved him, joined the Union Army. The old tobacco barn at the edge of the Northfield was searching when something strange he noticed. Wooden planks the floor of the barn was, but in one corner than the rest newer the planks seemed, as though recently they had been replaced. Up the planks Freeman pried, and a space beneath discovered, a cellar that had been deliberately concealed. For the rest of his life haunt him, what in that cellar he found would. Bodies there were, 8 women, in shallow graves buried. In canvas their remains wrapped, evidence of violence their skulls showing. And beside them smaller remains, infants, some newborns appearing, others perhaps a few months old. All dead, all in secret buried. All by a man who had used the law to acquire them, and then used isolation without consequence to murder them, hidden. The discovery Freeman reported to his commanding officer, a white captain from Massachusetts named Henry Clark. The findings Clark documented from enslaved people who at Graves's plantation had worked testimony took. People who confirmed that at auction Graves had purchased pregnant women. In the barn isolated had kept them, and that subsequently those women and their babies had disappeared. Consistent, detailed, damning the testimony was. For over a decade a murder factory Thornton Graves had been operating, using the auction system to acquire victims, using the law's indifference to enslaved people's lives to avoid detection, using his wealth and status to ensure him no one questioned. A full report Captain Clark prepared, as evidence of the barbarity of slavery, intending to use it as proof that not just exploitation the system enabled, but systematic murder. But during the war publication the report never saw precedence military priorities took. Away the evidence was filed, and in the chaos of Reconstruction, forgotten it was. Himself, Thornton Graves, was never prosecuted. In 1867 in Mississippi he died, under an assumed name, living, entirely having escaped justice. Never settled his estate was, never officially acknowledged his crimes. Beyond the general descriptions in Captain Clark's report, never identified the women he murdered were. Their names lost, their families never notified. In unmarked graves on a plantation that was eventually sold and subdivided and developed until of what had happened there no trace, remained their bodies buried. In military archives for decades the report itself sat, occasionally by historians researching the Civil War examined, but never significant attention given. Then in 1931, a graduate student at Emory University named Patricia Whitmore, on her thesis about slavery in coastal Georgia, working while reviewing Union Army documents the report discovered. Captain Clark's testimony, she read the descriptions of the bodies in the tobacco barn cellar found. Read the testimony from formerly enslaved people about of purchasing and murdering pregnant women, Thornton Graves's pattern. And that evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted she had discovered, she realized, atrocities that had been buried both literally and figuratively. Her findings Patricia attempted to publish. For a historical journal an article, prepared detailing what she had uncovered. But before publication could occur, from a lawyer representing the Graves family, a visit she received. That prominent citizens in Savannah, Thornton Graves's descendants were, the lawyer explained. That irreparably public revelation of these crimes would damage their reputations, and that to prevent publication legal action the family was prepared to take, young and lacking resources, to fight a prolonged legal battle. Her article Patricia withdrew, but her research she kept, copies of all the documents kept, Captain Clark's report and the testimony, and the evidence kept, in a sealed envelope with instructions that until 50 years after her death should not be opened. Everything she placed. In 1974 Patricia Whitmore died, and in accordance with her instructions in 2024 the envelope was opened. To the National Museum of African American History and Culture the contents were donated, where for researchers they remain available. That between 1843 and 1862 at least 8 pregnant women Thornton Graves purchased the report confirms. That while in his possession all of them disappeared. That in a concealed cellar in 1863 their remains, along with the remains of their infants, were discovered. The women's names the report does not contain, about where they came from or who their previous owners were, information does not provide. As victims of systematic murder enabled by a legal system that is property, rather than as human beings deserving of protection, treated them simply, lists them. Until 1891 Dinina lived, the age of 64 reaching, which given the hardship she had endured remarkably long was. In dawn she died, by her children and grandchildren surrounded, by people who loved her and valued her. In her final years, to anyone who would listen her story, she had continued to tell the evil of slavery had continued to document. That honestly, rather than constructing comfortable mythologies about benevolent masters and contented enslaved people, the nation needed to confront its history, had continued to insist. Among her papers after her death discovered was a journal. For over 40 years she had kept detailed accounts of everything that to her had happened. The journal contained, from on the rice plantation her childhood, to in Elias Cartwright's household the years, to in Savannah, where for 19 cents she was sold the auction, to via the Underground Railroad her escape, to rescue Ruth her return. On the final page of the journal, just weeks before her death, written to future readers, a message Dinina had included. She wrote, "For 19 cents I was sold, because that worthless in his eyes, I was the man who owned me wanted me to understand. But worthless I was never. Worthless no human being is, no matter what the law says, no matter how they are treated. I survived because this truth people who understood were willing everything to risk to help me." Jacob Brennan, Sarah and Hannah, Captain Porter, Michael the Sailor, Thomas Garrett, Frederick Douglass, and whose names I never learned, but whose courage my life saved dozens of others. This story I tell because special I am not, but because not I am. Like me millions there were, millions who suffered, millions who resisted, millions trying to be free who died, lost their names but mattered their lives, mattered their struggles. Remember them, honor them. And anyone tell you that anything other than what it was slavery was never allow. The greatest crime this nation ever committed. A crime by law enabled, by churches sanctioned, by politicians defended, and for those who benefited from it profitable. To the other people in Dinah's story, what happened its own form of closure provides. Incomplete and imperfect, but real. With the Underground Railroad, Jacob Brennan continued working until the Civil War began, at which point the Union Army he joined, and as an intelligence officer served. His experience with covert operations using to behind Confederate lines gather information. The war he survived, and until 1879 lived in Pennsylvania at age 62, dying. Sarah and Hannah, the women who in their cabin outside Savannah, Dinah sheltered. Until 1861 their safe house continued operating. When their work impossible, the increasing danger of Union naval blockades and Confederate paranoia made. Both the war survived, and to Pennsylvania relocated, where adjust to freedom they continued helping formerly enslaved people. Shortly after the Confederate surrender, in 1865 Elias Cartwright died. During the Union occupation his Charleston home was burned, his property confiscated, his fortune destroyed. In a boarding house bankrupt and alone he died, and of the crimes he had committed his obituary made no mention. As a respected businessman fallen on hard times, simply described him. By 20 years his wife Constance survived him, in reduced circumstances living, but in his abuse of Dinah, publicly acknowledging her complicity never. Everything during the war William Hadley lost, the man who Dinah's auction in Savannah had arranged, and after 1863 from historical records entirely disappeared. Until slavery was abolished, Cyrus Feldman, the auctioneer, continued conducting sales, then to selling only goods rather than people, briefly attempted to transition before in 1867 dying, likely from yellow fever. To Thornton Graves's plantation the most surprising epilogue belongs. After in 1863 the discovery of the bodies, after the property was abandoned and eventually sold, through multiple owners the land went before in 1921 by a black farming cooperative being purchased. Formerly enslaved people and their descendants who in Chatham County pooled resources to acquire property. For decades the land they farmed, unaware of its history, unaware of what there had been buried. In 1968, while near where the old tobacco barn had stood a field plowing, members of the cooperative bones discovered adult human bones and small infant bones, Remains that during the 1863 excavation had been missed. To authorities the discovery was reported, who before determining too old, the remains were to warrant criminal proceedings. A brief investigation conducted. In a cemetery in Savannah, in a section reserved for unknown individuals, the bones were reburied, with a simple marker that read, "Victims of slavery, died 1843 to 1862. In peace may they rest." Not enough it is to honor the lives that were stolen, the suffering that was inflicted, the evil that by legal and social systems, designed to protect wealth and power, rather than vulnerable people, was permitted, not remotely sufficient. But something it is. A small acknowledgement that existed these women, that mattered that not natural or inevitable their deaths were, but with impunity murders committed. Just a fragment of the larger atrocity that was American slavery diners' story, and the stories of the women Thornton Graves murdered represent. In 1860, 4 million people were enslaved, 4 million human beings as property legally defined, subject to being bought, sold, raped, worked to death. From families separated, without consequence murdered. As complex and tragic and important as diners' story each of those 4 million people had, most of which known will never be, because not considered worthy of documentation. Enslaved people were, their lives only in property ledgers and auction receipts recorded, by people who profited from that erasure their humanity deliberately erased. But survived some stories, by people like Dinina who on documenting their experiences insisted preserved, by abolitionists who the importance of bearing witness recognized preserved, by historians who sanitized versions of the past refused to accept preserved, by descendants who that remembering is itself an act of resistance against those who would prefer we forget understand preserved. Why hear these stories we tell this is? Why into archives we dig and evidence that powerful people tried to bury uncover? Why that the truth matters we insist, even when uncomfortable that truth is, even when to confront the reality it forces us, that on systematic evil, in part our nation was built, that atrocities our laws once sanctioned, that people we might have considered respectable, church-going, family-oriented, were capable of committing or enabling horrors we struggle to comprehend. For 19 cents Dinina was sold because that she was worthless Elias Cartwright wanted to demonstrate. But her survival, her escape, of her daughter Ruth her rescue, her 40 years of freedom, and on documenting her story her insistence, prove exactly the opposite. Invaluable she was, not because of her economic productivity or her usefulness to white people, but because human she was, because inherent worth her life had that diminish no auction could, erase no law could, destroy no amount of cruelty could. About Dinah's story, what do you think? To remember the victims of slavery like the women Thornton Graves murdered enough has been done, do you believe? The courage of people like Jacob Brennan and Sarah and Hannah, who everything to help others risked, how do we honor? In the comments your thoughts leave. And if moved you this story, if told these histories need to be you believe, with someone who needs to hear it, this video share. That subscribe button Hixo from Tartaria Codex 777, another story you never miss. Where the past stay buried we refuse to let. For watching, thank you. And in the next one, see you I will.